Picture a freezing morning in the high desert wilderness of the American West. Two state game wardens are just conducting a routine check on an illegal trapping camp, and they are suddenly shot down.
Right.
Mortally wounded, they're lying incapacitated in the snow, and then they are executed point blank with a rifle. So the man who pulled the trigger goes on the run, he sparks this massive 15-month FBI manhunt, and he eventually gets captured.
Which, I mean, in most parts of the world, that's just an open and shut case of capital murder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But when this man finally faces a jury, he doesn't just avoid a murder conviction. He somehow, incredibly, manages to convince the people in the jury box that he was the actual victim.
Yeah, it is, without a doubt, one of the most astonishing legal and cultural anomalies in modern American history. The case of Claude Dallas isn't simply a true crime story about some poacher who got caught.
No, not at all.
It's a profound, really intensely psychological case study of a man who constructed what we would call a sovereign individualist identity and then basically declared a one-man armed war against the authority of the state.
So, welcome to this deep dive. Today we are unpacking a deeply researched outline detailing this whole modern saga. It's a story that perfectly and, tragically encapsulates the cultural collision between the mythology of the Old West and the regulatory reality of the New West.
It really does.
We are going to examine the evidence, the trial transcripts, the sociology of the rural Great Basin, and the legal mechanics that allowed a double homicide to just be reframed as an act of pioneer self-defense.
And to really understand this, we have to look way past the surface-level narrative of just, a shootout in the woods. We have to analyze the socio-legal context of the region in the early 1980s.
Right, because the geography matters so much here.
Oh, absolutely. You have this vast, isolated geography where the lines drawn by lawmakers in distant capitals feel completely abstract to the people actually living there. And into that really volatile environment walks a man who fully embodies the extreme limits of the frontier spirit.
By the time we finish this exploration, you are going to find yourself questioning basically everything you thought you knew about the justice system. You'll see firsthand the terrifying power of regional mythology, and you'll be forced to reckon with the very dark, uncompromising limits of American individualism.
So let's start by looking at the architecture of this defiance, because to understand how two officers ended up dead in the snow at a place called Bull Camp, we first have to understand how a kid from the Midwest turned himself into an outlaw buckaroo.
Yeah.
Claude Dallas was not born into this rugged, unforgiving frontier. He manufactured that identity completely from scratch.
That is the detail that really anchored my entire view of this case. When you picture a mountain man who violently defies the federal government, the archetype that comes to mind is, someone born off the grid, right?
Right, raised in a log cabin.
Exactly. Taught to distrust the system from birth. But the reality of Claude Dallas is remarkably domestic. He was born in Winchester, Virginia in 1950. His family eventually relocated, and he was raised on a dairy farm in Morrow County, Ohio.
Okay.
Yeah, Ohio. He went to a standard public high school and graduated in 1967.
Which means his upbringing was defined by complete agrarian stability. It was the post-war American Midwest. It was predictable, regulated, and very tethered to the community.
But Dallas rejected that completely.
He really did. The source material points to a fascinating origin point for his worldview. His true education didn't come from the dairy farm at all. It came from literature.
All the novels.
Yeah, specifically, he became absolutely consumed by the novels of Zane Grey and historical accounts of 19th century mountain men.
I want to spend a second on Zane Grey because those books weren't just, casual entertainment in the mid-20th century. They were ideological blueprints. Zane Grey romanticized the lone gunslinger.
Right, the man outside the law.
Yes, the man who operated outside the corruption of eastern cities and answered only to his own moral code. If you're a restless teenager on a predictable dairy farm, that literature offers a highly seductive alternative reality. You aren't just reading a story, you are absorbing a philosophy that says true nobility requires complete isolation and absolute self-reliance.
And that philosophy took root so deeply that at 18 years old, Dallas didn't just, casually adopt the aesthetic. He hitchhiked across the entire country, aiming for the high desert of southeastern Oregon.
He landed at the Alvord Ranch, right?
He did. And once there, he engaged in a total immersive adoption of the buckaroo persona. And it's really important to clarify what that means in the context of the Great Basin, because the buckaroo culture is heavily influenced by the early vaquero traditions.
It's very specific.
Highly specific. It has its own codes of dress, a grueling work ethic, and an intense pride in specialized horsemanship and survival skills.
It's essentially method acting that just never stops.
Yeah.
He bought into the lifestyle so completely that it dictated every facet of his existence. He mastered the roping, he wore the specific gear, and crucially, he armed himself to fit the historical narrative.
The firearms are a big part of it.
Huge. The sources note he acquired a Winchester Model 94 lever-action rifle. And that isn't just a utilitarian choice. That firearm is symbolically revered as the gun that won the West. He was basically curating his own myth.
He was. But historical romanticism is one thing, The transition into actual sociopathy is another. And the outline provides us with early, deeply disturbing warning signs that this wasn't just a young man playing cowboy.
Right, the animal cruelty.
Yeah. While he was working as a ranch hand, his peers noted an alarming cruelty toward animals. He was specifically known for kicking dogs.
Which is a massive red flag in any psychological profile.
Yeah.
The literature on violent offenders frequently points to animal cruelty as a precursor to violence against humans. It demonstrates a fundamental lack of empathy and a desire to exert absolute dominance over vulnerable creatures.
Exactly.
And alongside that physical cruelty, he was already showing a complete disregard for legal boundaries. He began persistently trapping bobcats out of season, which was a clear violation of state law.
And those trapping violations really show the early stages of his rejection of state authority. But the ideological cement really sets in 1973.
This is such a pivotal moment.
It is the institutional trauma. So Claude Dallas gets arrested for draft evasion. Now, the military draft had effectively ended by this point, and Dallas claimed he simply hadn't received the induction notices because of his transient nomadic lifestyle as a ranch hand.
And honestly, whether he intentionally dodged the draft or just missed the mail is almost irrelevant compared to what happens next. The federal agents who took him into custody didn't just arrest him. They subjected him to profound psychological and public humiliation.
The details of that arrest are critical to understanding his future actions. The agents literally removed the heels of his cowboy boots.
Which sounds minor if you don't know the culture, but
But if you understand the buckaroo identity, a man's boots are a foundational part of his physical and psychological posture. Removing the heels physically drops his stature, it completely alters his gait, and it strips him of the defining symbol of a rider.
it's degrading.
Very. And then they paraded him through public airports in handcuffs.
The optics of that are just brutal.
Yeah.
They took a man who styled himself as this untamable sovereign of the high desert, physically dismantled his costume, and paraded him like a captured animal in the most modern bureaucratic environment imaginable in an airport.
Right.
Even though the charges were eventually dropped, you can't just undo that kind of psychic damage.
You absolutely cannot. The sources describe the aftermath perfectly. The experience left him with a blistering rancor toward law enforcement. The state was no longer just some abstract entity that occasionally issued trapping regulations. It was an intrusive, malevolent force that had personally humiliated him.
And he made a vow right then and there. He would never be taken into custody again.
Never again.
You don't go through a psychological dismantling like that and just return to normal life. The ideology hardens into something militant. And we see that hardening play out 6 years later, escalating his behavior from minor trapping offenses into literal international defiance. Let's look at the 1979 Yukon expedition.
So this expedition is the vital bridge in the timeline between the humiliated young man in 1973 and the killer in 1981. Dallas and a group of friends traveled to the Yukon River in Canada. And his friends approach the trip normally.
Like regular people.
Yeah, they go through legal customs channels, they present their identification, and they cross the border.
But Claude Dallas refuses. Instead of taking 10 minutes to go through customs, he chooses to cross the Canadian border heavily armed, sneaking through the dense wilderness.
The source material literally describes him slipping through the forest like Rambo to avoid detection.
Which highlights the absurdity and the danger of his mindset. And while in the Yukon, he illegally harvests a Dall sheep. He even jokes with his companions about trying to achieve a Grand Slam, which is a hunting term for successfully harvesting all 4 species of North American wild sheep.
And that detail completely shatters a narrative that his defenders would lean on heavily during his trials. Later on, people tried to paint Dallas as a pure subsistence hunter.
Right, a man just trying to live humbly off the land.
Exactly, killing only what he needed to survive the harsh winters. But sneaking across an international border to bag a Dall sheep for Grand Slam has absolutely nothing to do with subsistence. That is ego. That is pure trophy hunting.
It proves that his criminality was not born out of a desperate need for survival. It was an ideological rejection of modern conservation laws. He wasn't avoiding customs because he had outstanding warrants or couldn't afford a visa.
No, not at all.
He was avoiding the border because the very concept of an international border and the jurisdiction it implied deeply offended his worldview. He fundamentally believed that a man's right to hunt and traverse the land superseded any government's authority to regulate it through tags, lotteries, or checkpoints.
Think about it. We all have moments where we might bend a minor rule, right? Jaywalking on an empty street or driving a little over the speed limit.
Sure.
And usually we do it not because we're terrible people, but just to subtly prove to ourselves that in that specific harmless moment, we have a tiny bit of autonomy. But Dallas took that universally understood human impulse and just weaponized it. He didn't just bend rules. He decided the concept of rules was an illusion.
And that ideological refusal to be governed is what sets the stage for the absolute tragedy in the winter of 1980. Dallas decides to set up a winter trapping camp in a place called Bull Camp. The geography of this location is not an accident. It is incredibly intentional.
Right. Bull Camp is situated in the high desert of southwestern Idaho, deep along the South Fork of the Owyhee River.
When you look at a map of this area, you immediately understand the appeal for someone like Dallas. It is profoundly isolated. He is essentially wedged into a jurisdictional corner. He's roughly 13 miles east of the Oregon border and just 3 miles north of the Nevada border.
It's the kind of terrain where radio signals just die, and the nearest paved road is basically an abstract concept. And out there in the freezing cold, he is running an operation of roughly 80 bobcat traps.
Running 80 traps is an exhausting, massive undertaking. It requires constant movement, extreme physical endurance, and total dedication. But there's a massive legal problem here. The bobcat trapping season was entirely closed in the state of Idaho at this time.
Right. It was open just 3 miles south in Nevada, but Dallas was operating strictly on his own calendar. He didn't care where the imaginary state line fell.
But you can't run an 80-trap operation without leaving a footprint. About 10 days before the murders, 2 men, Don and Eddie Carlin, who leased the wintering grounds in that area, crossed paths with Dallas.
And they saw his camp.
They saw everything. They saw the illegal bobcat hides drying. They saw fresh poached venison. And because they knew the area, they warned Dallas that Idaho Fish and Game wardens frequently patrolled that specific basin.
And Dallas's response to that warning is chilling, and frankly, it proves premeditation. He didn't pack up his camp. He didn't try to hide the evidence.
No.
He looked directly at the Carlins and told them that he, quote, settles his business with a gun and that he would be ready for them.
He is literally declaring a willingness to commit murder to protect his illegal hides. The Carlins, understandably disturbed by this interaction, report him to the authorities,
which triggers the fatal confrontation. It brings us to the morning of January 5, 1981. 2 Idaho Department of Fish and Game officers arrive at the rim of the basin above Bull Camp. The lead officer is Bill Pogue.
And Pogue is a 25-year veteran of the department. He has a reputation as a stern, no-nonsense lawman, but he is also a highly talented pen and ink wildlife artist. He deeply loves the wilderness he protects.
Right. And accompanying him is Officer Conley Elms. Elms is younger, incredibly diligent, a man who had worked relentlessly just to secure his position within the department.
So they arrive at the rim and actually bump into Dallas, who is away from his tent, helping a friend retrieve some supplies. That friend is Jim Stevens, a potato farmer from Nevada who had come up to visit.
From the rim, the 2 officers, Dallas and Stevens, hike roughly 3/4 of a mile down a steep, really treacherous trail into the heart of Bull Camp. And the officers begin what should have been a tense, but ultimately routine search and arrest protocol.
The tactical reconstruction of what happens next is devastating to read because it hinges on a single catastrophic oversight. The officers know Dallas is dangerous. They decide to disarm him immediately. They pat him down and confiscate a .22 caliber pistol that he's wearing in a shoulder holster.
And they also take the precaution of unloading Jim Stevens' weapon. So in their minds, they have neutralized the threat.
But they miss a second, much more powerful weapon.
Yes. Dallas is wearing a 4-inch .357 caliber Ruger Security 6 revolver, completely concealed in a hip holster beneath his heavy winter clothing.
I was trying to wrap my head around the logistics of this search. How do 2 trained game wardens miss a bulky .357 on a man's hip? But when you factor in the environment, it starts to make terrifying sense.
It's January in the high desert. Dallas is wearing thick, heavy, layered canvas and wool.
Exactly. And psychologically, when the officers found the shoulder holster, They achieved a sense of completion. They found a gun, so their brains registered the primary threat as handled. They didn't anticipate the extreme paranoia of a man carrying redundant, concealed firepower in his own camp.
And that psychological blind spot proved fatal. With Dallas seemingly disarmed, Officer Elms enters the wall tent to conduct the search. He emerges moments later carrying 2 of the illegal bobcat hides.
It's the definitive proof of the poaching.
Right. Officer Pogue turns to Dallas and plainly states, "You're under arrest."
We have the exact account of what happens next because Jim Stevens, the Nevada farmer, was standing right there as an eyewitness. According to Stevens, the violence was explosive and instantaneous. The moment Pogue announces the arrest, Dallas draws the concealed .357 revolver.
He doesn't hesitate at all.
Not a second. He fires 2 rounds directly into Officer Pogue. He then rapidly pivots and fires 2 rounds into Officer Elms.
The stopping power of a .357 Magnum at close range is just devastating. Both officers are instantly incapacitated, falling to the snow. Even while mortally wounded, Pogue attempts a final, heroic act. He tries to draw his own weapon to return fire and protect his partner.
But Dallas sees the movement and shoots Pogue 2 more times.
At this exact second, we have a terrible, violent shootout. A man resisting arrest has gunned down 2 officers.
But what Dallas does next fundamentally shifts the nature of the crime. He doesn't panic. He doesn't drop the gun and run.
The timeline slows down here in a sickening way. Dallas stops. He looks at the 2 bleeding, incapacitated men on the ground. He retreats back into his wall tent.
He actually goes inside.
He goes inside, he sets down the .357 revolver, and he deliberately picks up a completely different weapon, a .22 caliber lever-action Marlin rifle. He walks back outside, stands over the officers, and shoots both of them, execution style, directly in the head.
That tactical shift is the absolute crux of this entire tragedy. From a legal and psychological standpoint, pausing a gunfight, consciously deciding to swap a handgun for a rifle, walking back out into the cold, and delivering point-blank headshots. I mean, it entirely shatters any argument of a spontaneous, panic-driven shootout.
Absolutely.
It is the definition of cold, calculated premeditation. It is an execution designed to ensure there are absolutely no surviving witnesses, save for his terrified friend.
You are exactly right. The legal concept of the heat of passion, which his defense would later rely heavily upon, implies an overwhelming surge of emotion that clouds rational judgment.
Like a bar fight that escalates.
Exactly. But changing weapons requires motor function, decision-making, and intent. It demonstrates a definitive cognitive choice to end their lives.
How any jury in America could look past that specific detail to deliver an acquittal is something we are going to tear into. Because the aftermath of the shooting is just as macabre. Dallas has now murdered 2 agents of the state. He has crossed the ultimate line.
And what he does next begins his transformation from a cold-blooded killer into a dark, localized folk hero.
The immediate logistics of the cover-up are grim and chaotic. Dallas turns to Jim Stevens, who has just watched his friend execute 2 men, and coerces him into helping move the bodies.
Stevens is utterly traumatized, but he complies out of sheer terror. They manage to load Officer Pogue's body onto a pack mule, leading the animal up the steep 3/4-mile trail back to Stevens's vehicle.
But when they return for Officer Elms, the environment works against them. Elms was a very large man, weighing roughly 280 pounds. When they try to load him, the mule completely balks. It refuses to carry the weight.
So Dallas is forced to drag Elms's body through the snow and mud, ultimately dumping him into the shallow, freezing waters of the Owyhee River.
Having hidden one body and loaded the other, Dallas forces Stevens to drive him across the border to Paradise Hill, Nevada. Their destination is the home of an acquaintance named George Nielsen.
And during this drive, Dallas is entirely lucid. He is actively concocting a complex cover story, instructing Stevens on exactly what to tell the police, and even what to tell Stevens' own wife to ensure their alibis align.
When they arrive at Paradise Hill, Nielsen doesn't call the cops.
No, he actually helps them.
He helps Dallas and Stevens burn the bloody clothing and evidence. Dallas then commandeers Nielsen's pickup truck, with Pogue's body still in the back, and drives roughly 80 miles deep into the remote Nevada desert. He meticulously hides Pogue's body in an abandoned coyote den.
And he concealed it so effectively that investigators wouldn't discover the remains until October of 1982. That's nearly 2 years after the murder.
With the evidence burned and the bodies hidden, Dallas utilizes his profound skills as a woodsman to vanish. This triggers a massive, highly publicized 15-month manhunt led by the FBI.
Dallas retreats into the pocked, unforgiving landscape of the Ojai and Humboldt regions. This area is a labyrinth of jagged canyons, deep sagebrush, and thousands of abandoned mine shafts left over from the silver rushes.
It is virtually impossible to search effectively from the air, and dangerous to search on foot.
But the terrain is only half the story. The real reason he evaded the FBI for over a year wasn't just his survival skills. It was what sociologists call the cult of the fugitive. He had a massive, silent support network.
This is where the story shifts from true crime to a profound sociological study. Dallas wasn't just eating bark and hiding in caves for 15 months. The local community, particularly in places like Paradise Valley, effectively threw a shield over him.
Despite being the subject of a nationwide manhunt, despite his face being plastered on every wanted poster, Dallas was frequently seen out in public.
Really? Out in public?
Yes, he drank in local saloons, he ate in diners, he even picked up mail at the Paradise Hill bar.
And for 15 months, out of all those people who saw him, not a single person picked up a phone to tip off the FBI.
Not one.
To really understand why an entire community of ranchers, miners, and locals would actively hide a man who just executed 2 state workers, you have to look through their specific cultural lens at that exact moment in the early 1980s.
The source material provides a brilliant phrase for this. The region harbored a, quote, wicked disdain for any authority. In the late 70s and early 80s, the American West was experiencing the Sagebrush Rebellion.
Right, that was a huge political movement.
It was a massive political and cultural pushback against federal and state land management. The people in these rural trapping and ranching communities felt completely alienated by bureaucrats in offices hundreds of miles away, telling them how to manage the land their families had worked for generations.
And the Department of Fish and Game was often the most visible, boots-on-the-ground manifestation of that bureaucracy. To the locals, the game wardens weren't heroes protecting nature. They were seen, and this is a direct disparaging quote from the sources, as flower-fondling environmentalists who cared more about animal quotas than human livelihoods.
Now, we have to view this dynamic neutrally to understand the mechanics of the manhunt. Whether you agree with their fiercely anti-government politics or not, you have to understand their reality to see why they protected him.
Absolutely.
To the patrons of those saloons, Claude Dallas ceased to be a murderer. He became an avatar. He represented the idealized Old West values of absolute self-sufficiency, violently pushing back against the encroaching regulatory New West. By hiding him, they weren't just protecting a friend, they felt they were protecting a way of life.
It was a proxy war against the government, and Dallas was their champion. But eventually, the sheer weight of federal resources catches up. On April 18, 1982, the FBI gets a break.
Right. Special Agent Franz Nenzel, utilizing expensive surveillance and tracking techniques, locates Dallas at a mobile home just north of Winnemucca, Nevada.
The apprehension was entirely in character for Dallas.
Yeah.
He didn't walk out with his hands up. He attempted to flee, triggering a high-speed pursuit that culminated in a shootout with federal agents.
During the exchange of gunfire, Dallas was wounded in the leg. Finally, injured and surrounded, his tenure as the 400th fugitive ever placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list came to an end.
At this point, if you're reading the headlines, you assume the story is basically over. The fugitive is caught. The evidence is overwhelming. He literally shot 2 cops in front of a witness. The trial should be a total formality, a brief administrative step before a life sentence or death row.
You would think so. But the 1982 trial reveals just how deeply the regional justice system had been infected by the same Old West mythology that fueled the manhunt.
The trial was held in Canyon County, Idaho, and Dallas was represented by a defense attorney named Bill Mock. Mock recognized immediately that he couldn't argue the facts of the shooting. Jim Stevens' eyewitness testimony and the forensic evidence were indisputable. Dallas pulled the trigger.
So Mock executed a brilliant, audacious, and highly controversial legal strategy. He decided to put the dead warden, Bill Pogue, on trial.
It was a masterclass in victim blaming. Mock understood the cultural resentments of the jury pool. He brought in a parade of testimonies focusing on Pogue's past career as a police chief down in Winnemucca.
The defense systematically painted Pogue not as a dedicated public servant, but as a tough guy lawman who relished intimidation. The narrative Mock spun was that Pogue came into bull camp gunning for Dallas.
Mock argued that Pogue was overly aggressive, that he physically pushed Dallas against a wall during the arrest, and that his demeanor gave Dallas a reasonable and immediate fear for his own life.
Legally, this taps into the doctrine of self-defense, suggesting that Pogue was the initial aggressor, which theoretically restores the right of self-defense to the person being arrested.
Mock was playing the jury's own deep-seated cultural biases right back to them. He essentially told them, "You all know how these overzealous government agents act. You know they push us around."
And the atmosphere inside the courtroom completely reinforced this inverted reality. The gallery was packed every single day with a group dubbed by the press as the Dallas cheerleaders.
The Dallas cheerleaders.
Yeah. These were women and locals who openly supported Dallas, creating an incredibly intimidating environment for the prosecution. Some of them were even circulating petitions pushing for Dallas to be granted total amnesty.
That psychological pressure on the jury was immense. They were surrounded by their peers who viewed the defendant as a hero. And the verdict they delivered on October 24th, 1982 was absolutely staggering. After deliberating, the jury acquitted Claude Dallas of both first and second-degree murder.
Wow.
Let that sink in. He shot 2 state officers in the head, and he was acquitted of murder.
Instead, they found him guilty of 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter. Under Idaho Code Section 18-40006, voluntary manslaughter is defined as a killing without malice aforethought, occurring upon a sudden quarrel or heat of passion.
They also convicted him of a firearm enhancement charge and a misdemeanor concealment charge for hiding Pogue's body in the coyote den.
We really have to unpack the legal gymnastics the jury performed here. How does a jury reconcile the heat of passion manslaughter definition with the fact that Dallas retreated to his tent, switched to a lever-action rifle, and executed them?
Exactly. A sudden quarrel explains the .357. It does not explain the .22 Marlin.
That specific contradiction was the intense friction point during jury deliberations. Based on post-trial interviews, we know the jury completely bought into the defense's framing of the initial shootout.
They essentially applied a localized stand-your-ground mentality.
Right. They believed Dallas was reacting to an overzealous, physically aggressive officer. They viewed the first shots from the .357 revolver as a tragic but somewhat justified reaction in the heat of the moment.
But the execution shots with the rifle, they couldn't frame that as self-defense.
Exactly. The rifle was the bridge too far. The jury foreman, a man named Milo Moore, gave a quote after the trial that perfectly illustrates the terrifying power of the myth. Moore admitted that if Dallas hadn't used the rifle for those final, point-blank headshots, the jury likely would have acquitted him entirely and let him walk out of the courthouse a free man.
That is deeply unsettling. It implies that in the eyes of that jury, a citizen has the right to gun down law enforcement officers simply because the officer is acting sternly during a lawful arrest for a crime the citizen definitely committed.
They were desperately searching for any legal loophole to acquit him, and the rifle was the only thing they couldn't intellectually excuse.
Judge Edward Lodge, who presided over the case, recognized this profound miscarriage of justice. While he was legally bound by the jury's verdict of manslaughter, he used his sentencing power to signal his utter disagreement with their leniency.
What did he do?
Judge Lodge handed down the absolute maximum penalty allowed under the law for those specific convictions, sentencing Claude Dallas to 30 years in prison.
So, justice of a sort is finally served. Dallas is stripped of his buckaroo freedom and locked in a cage for 3 decades.
The system worked, barely. But the mythology surrounding this guy was so potent, so culturally infectious, that it eventually breached the walls of the prison itself. Let's talk about the Easter Sunday escape.
Fast forward to March 30th, 1986. Dallas has been housed at the Idaho State Correctional Institution, a maximum security facility east of Kuna, Idaho. It's Easter Sunday. And suddenly, the most famous inmate in the state simply vanishes.
The official story released by the prison administration sounds like a movie script. They claim that Dallas managed to acquire a pair of wire cutters, snuck out into the yard, and physically snapped his way through 2 heavy, reinforced chain-link perimeter fences under the cover of darkness.
That was the narrative they pushed. But investigative journalists and insiders quickly poked massive holes in that story. The reality seems to have been much more mundane and vastly more embarrassing for the state.
According to a corrections guard named George Baird, who was on duty that night, as well as subsequent investigations, the wire cutter story was likely staged after the fact.
So if he didn't cut the fence, how does a high-profile cop killer escape maximum security?
The prevailing evidence suggests that Dallas literally just walked right out the front doors of the facility.
You're kidding me.
I wish I was. Around 8 p.m., as a large group of Easter Sunday visitors was leaving the prison lobby, Dallas simply blended into the crowd and walked out into the parking lot.
Wow. The cut fence was allegedly manufactured later by panicked prison officials to cover up the profound institutional embarrassment of having their highest-profile inmate outsmart the entire multi-million-dollar security apparatus by just strolling through the lobby.
The incompetence is staggering.
Hmm.
But what's even more fascinating is that once he's outside, the myth takes over again. He doesn't just survive in the wild. He has highly coordinated help.
And this time, his support network extends far beyond the off-the-grid trappers in Nevada. The sources highlight persistent rumors that during his time on the run, he was actively assisted by a prominent female Republican Party activist.
While she was never publicly named and charged, the rumor itself illustrates a crucial point. Dallas's appeal crossed significant social and political strata.
He wasn't just a folk hero to impoverished ranchers. His extreme anti-government, sovereign citizen ideology resonated with organized political activists who saw him as a symbol of pure, unregulated liberty.
He manages to evade the authorities for almost another full year, but his luck finally runs out far from the snowy wilderness of Bull Camp. On March 8, 1987, he is captured by the FBI outside a suburban 7-Eleven convenience store in Riverside, California.
They immediately extradite him back to Idaho to face trial for the prison escape. And the second trial is where the legal system's vulnerability to narrative is exposed all over again. Dallas's defense team employs what is known in law as a necessity defense.
Let's break down how a necessity defense works, because it's usually reserved for extreme, immediate physical danger. For example, if you are locked in a burning building and the only way to survive is to break a window and trespass onto someone else's property, you can claim necessity.
Right, you broke the law to prevent a greater immediate harm, your own death.
That is the exact legal framework. To successfully claim a necessity defense for a prison escape, an inmate typically has to prove that there was a specific imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury, that there was no time to complain to authorities or seek a legal remedy, and that they immediately surrendered once they were safe.
And Dallas took the stand and testified that he had to escape because the prison guards were actively threatening his life and he feared he would be murdered in his cell.
Which is incredibly convenient.
Yeah.
He breaks out of maximum security, stays on the run for a year, gets caught at a convenience store in California, and then claims he only left because the guards were mean to him.
Yeah. The prosecution argued fiercely that even if he felt threatened, failing to turn himself in for a year completely invalidated the necessity claim.
Legally, the prosecution was entirely correct. But culturally, they were fighting a losing battle. The jury in this second trial listened to the arguments, deliberated, and acquitted him again.
They found his necessity defense credible.
I try to put myself in the shoes of the prosecutors. You have a man who executed 2 wardens, got a light sentence because the jury liked his cowboy hat, walked out the front door of a prison, and then a second jury essentially says, yeah, the prison system is corrupt. We don't blame you for leaving.
It proves that when the strict letter of the law conflicts with a deeply held cultural narrative in this case, the romance of the persecuted Western frontiersman, the cultural narrative will almost always win in the minds of a local jury.
It was a humiliating realization for the state of Idaho. This second acquittal proved to authorities that they were fundamentally incapable of holding Claude Dallas in their jurisdiction.
The mythology had completely infected their own justice system. Every time they put him in front of an Idaho jury, the law failed.
So they decide on exile. They realize the only way to keep him behind bars is to physically remove him from the Great Basin and sever his connection to the local lore.
Exactly. From 1987 to 1989, the prison system bounced him through various facilities in Nebraska and New Mexico. They were playing a shell game, trying to keep him isolated from his support network and the press.
Finally, in July 1989, he is transferred to a high-security state prison in Kansas, where he would serve the vast majority of his remaining sentence.
And his behavior in Kansas is incredibly revealing. You might expect a man who fought the FBI in the desert to be a nightmare inmate, constantly rioting or fighting guards.
But the sources reveal the exact opposite. He was described as a very quiet, compliant prisoner. He worked steadily as a prison porter. The guards interviewed noted that he was very smart and caused almost no institutional trouble.
But we shouldn't mistake his quiet compliance for rehabilitation. Beneath that calm exterior, the absolute unyielding defiance that drove him to Bull Camp was still entirely intact.
And we see that perfectly illustrated in 2001. After serving roughly 20 years, Dallas comes up for parole. Based on his clean disciplinary record, he could have easily walked out of prison that year.
But the parole board presents him with the standard conditions of release. They tell him he will be freed, but he must agree to submit to regular drug testing and wear an electronic monitoring device and ankle bracelet to track his location.
And Dallas flat out refuses.
He refuses.
He looks at the offer of freedom, looks at the ankle monitor, and chooses to go back to a tiny concrete cell.
Because to Dallas, submitting to the ankle monitor wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a complete ideological surrender. It meant allowing the state to physically attach its authority to his body.
To a man whose entire identity was built on sovereign individualism and untracked movement through the wilderness, the digital tether was a fate worse than physical incarceration. It was a line he would not cross.
So he remains in prison for 4 more years, choosing a cage over compliance. He was finally released on his mandatory date of February 6, 2005.
He served 22 years of his original 30-year sentence, receiving the standard 8-year reduction for good behavior. He walked out of prison a free man at the age of 54.
And as you can imagine, the institutional fallout and the lingering pain for the victims' families was immense. The families of Bill Pogue and Conley Elms were forced to watch the man who executed their loved ones become a folk hero, escape prison, win court battles, and eventually walk free.
They publicly called him exactly what they believed him to be, a remorseless psychopath and a manipulator who used a historical costume to literally get away with murder.
But the deepest, most permanent legacy of Claude Dallas might be the profound transformation of the Idaho Department of Fish and Game.
Before the murders at Bull Camp in 1981, game wardens were largely seen as wilderness rangers. They were biologists, conservationists, people who loved the outdoors, and occasionally handed out fines for fishing without a license.
But the brutal executions of Pogue and Elms shattered that entirely. The source material poignantly states that the agency permanently lost its wilderness innocence.
The tragedy forced a complete systemic paradigm shift. The department realized their officers were patrolling incredibly isolated areas where backup was hours away, dealing with armed individuals who might view them as enemy combatants.
They completely overhauled their training protocols. Wardens stopped being just biologists and were forced to become heavily armed, tactically trained, wary wilderness policemen.
The state invested heavily in personal protective equipment, advanced weaponry, and high-risk scenario training. The ultimate irony of this entire saga is just staggering.
It really is.
Claude Dallas claimed he was fighting to preserve the Old West, a romanticized landscape completely free of government regulation, police presence, and modern intrusion.
But through his own extreme violent actions, he forced the state to adapt. He forced them to bring a massive, militarized, highly vigilant New West presence directly into the backcountry.
In his violent attempt to protect the isolation he loved, he systematically destroyed it forever.
That is the tragic paradox at the heart of this deep dive. Claude Dallas didn't just kill 2 men, he challenged the fundamental authority of the modern state in the remote interior of America.
And while he may have won the courtroom battles and secured his place in localized mythology, he left behind a legacy of professional wariness and a deep cultural division that persists to this very day.
After his release in 2005, Dallas essentially vanished from public view, fading back into the landscape with unconfirmed sightings in Utah, Alaska, and Oregon.
We started this deep dive talking about the collision between 2 different eras of America. We've traced Claude Dallas's journey from a predictable dairy farm in Ohio to the bloody, freezing basin of Bull Camp to the bizarre courtrooms where an outlaw successfully manipulated the frontier myth to his advantage.
It is a story that proves how fragile the law can be when it goes up against a deeply entrenched, romanticized cultural narrative. He proved that in certain corners of the map, the myth of the West is still vastly more powerful than the laws written to govern it.
So, as we wrap up this exploration of the sources, I want to leave you with a lingering thought. Think back to Claude Dallas in 2001, sitting quietly in that high-security Kansas prison cell. He had the keys to his own cell in his hand.
He really did.
He could have walked out into the open air years earlier if he had simply agreed to let the state strap a digital tracker to his ankle. But he looked at that compromise and chose a concrete box instead.
Which is incredible.
It leaves you wondering, if the ultimate Old West definition of freedom requires absolute, ungovernable isolation at all costs, is it possible that the true American frontiersman isn't a romantic hero at all, but just a man who is fundamentally, utterly incompatible with modern human society?
Thank you for joining us on this exploration.